I was standing on the porch of a house I paid for, holding a cherry pie still warm through the tin. I'd come to wish my son and my daughter-in-law a happy Thanksgiving. And then I heard her voice come through the window. "Thank God the old woman isn't coming. We can finally have 1 year where we eat a meal without having to put up with her." Then my son laughed. Not the awkward laugh of a man caught in the middle of something. A real one. The kind that comes out before you remember the person being made fun of is your own mother. I stood still. I didn't knock. I didn't go in. I set the cherry pie down on the porch railing and I walked back to my car. But before I started the engine, I took out my phone. And I opened my banking app. Because I had just realized something. The dinner they were all sitting around waiting for was being paid for with my money. I looked at that pending charge for a few seconds. Then I froze the card. In about 40 minutes, 20 people were going to walk into that house. And there was not going to be a dinner. The worst part? I didn't do it in anger. I was completely calm. I knew my son would call. I knew my daughter-in-law would lose her mind. I knew they'd call me selfish, bitter, a crazy old woman. I did it anyway. My name is Willa. I'm 67 now. I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, on the southeast side. For 41 years, I was a tailor. Alterations, mostly a shop on Eastern with my name in the window from 1983 until I closed it in 2019. Wedding dresses, suits, uniforms, prom, everything. If you got married on this side of Grand Rapids between about 1990 and 2015, there is a fair chance I had my hands in your hem. And that trade gave me the one idea that this entire story is built on, so give me a minute. Every good garment is made with a seam allowance. It's the extra fabric folded under and stitched down on the inside, where nobody sees it. Half an inch, sometimes more on a quality piece. And the reason it's there is simple. People change. A man gains weight, a girl grows 2 inches between the fitting and the wedding, a suit gets handed down to a bigger brother. And when that happens, you don't buy a new garment. You let out the seam, you pick the stitches, you open the fold, and you use the fabric that was hiding in there all along. That's the whole trade. That's 41 years. But here's what every tailor knows and almost no customer does. The allowance is finite. There is a specific amount of hidden fabric in that garment, and when you've let it all out, that's it. There isn't any more. You can't will it into existence. And people come into your shop and stand on that box and look at you in the mirror and say, "Just let it out a little more," and you have to tell them there's nothing left. 41 years I said that sentence to people, and I never once said it to my own son. Ansel was my husband for 38 years. He died 6 years ago, a stroke in the garage on a Saturday morning, 64 years old, and I found him. I don't say much more about that. There isn't much more that goes into words. He was a printer, commercial press, 33 years. He had ink permanently in the creases of his knuckles, and I used to be able to tell what account he'd been running by the color of it. We had one boy, Nils. He's 37 now, 34 when this happened. He married Bryn about 4 years before all this. She's in commercial interiors, designs, office fit-outs, showrooms, that kind of thing. And she's very good at it, and I want that on the record because it matters later. Now here's what I did after Ansel died, and I need to tell it plainly because everything else follows from it. 6 months after the funeral, I sold my shop. And then, about a year after that, I did the thing that ended up costing me 3 years. We had a big house, 5 bedrooms out on the northeast side with a yard Ansel had spent 2 decades on, paid off in 2011. And I was one woman in it, 61 years old, going up and down the stairs to rooms nobody had been in since 2009. So I bought a townhouse. Small, 2 bedrooms, a patch of yard the size of a tablecloth. And I let Nils and Bryn move into the big house. Not sold, not rented, moved in. My name stayed on the deed. I kept paying the property taxes because I was the owner and it seemed simplest. I kept the homeowner's insurance for the same reason. And then, over 3 years, the rest of it happened the way these things do, which is one reasonable step at a time. The internet and the cable were on my account because switching it was a hassle, and Nils said, "Just leave it, we'll square up." We never squared up. I stayed on his car loan as a co-signer because his credit was thin and it saved him about $80 a month, and what's the harm? I paid for the furnace when it went in 2021 because I owned the furnace. I paid for the roof in 2022 Because I owned the roof. And every one of those decisions was correct on its own. That's what I want you to understand. I could defend each one of them individually to anybody. I was letting out the seam, a little at a time, and every time I let it out, it fit again, and everybody was comfortable, and nobody had to have a conversation. Now, the thing I did that was genuinely wrong, and I'm going to say it now instead of hiding it at the end. I did not stop behaving like that was my house. I had a key, and I used it. Not constantly, but I'd let myself in on a Tuesday afternoon to check whether the sump was running. I adjusted the thermostat every single time I was over there, because they kept it at 72, and Ansel and I ran that house at 67 for 30 years, and I could not get my hand to leave it alone. And I refolded the napkins. I want to be precise about that, because it comes up. Bryn had a way she set a table, and I had a way. And mine involved a fold Ansel's mother taught me in 1979, and I would go around a table she had already set and redo 6 napkins while she was in the kitchen. I did that, more than once. That is a true thing that a person did in another person's home. So, when I tell you what I heard through that window, I need you to know that some of it was fair. If you've ever been the one who can't stop tidying somebody else's house and told yourself it's helping, sit with that a second. I did not sit with it for 3 years, and it cost me. Thanksgiving. Bryn had told me 4 o'clock. She said her parents were coming, and her sister, and a few people from her firm. I came at 2:15. And I want to say why, because it's the saddest sentence in this whole story. I came early because I wanted to be useful. Not to snoop, not to check on anything. I came 2 hours early because I thought there'd be a stretch of time in a kitchen where I'd be handing her things and we'd talk, the way Ansel's mother and I used to. I'd baked a cherry pie at 7 that morning, lattice top. The tin was still warm when I put it on the passenger seat, and I remember thinking I should have brought a towel for the upholstery. I parked down the block because there were already cars in the drive, and I didn't want to be blocking anybody in. And I came up those steps and stopped, because I could hear them through the front window, which was open about 4 inches at the bottom, the way that window has always been, because the sash is warped and it doesn't seat. I know that window. I painted the trim on that window in 2004. And Bryn was saying, and she was laughing while she said it, which is the part that took the longest to get past. Honestly, thank God the old bat's not coming. And somebody said something I didn't catch. And then my son said, I know, we can actually eat a meal without her turning the heat down and refolding everything. And they both laughed. And then Bryn said, and I'm giving you this one word for word because I've had 3 years to forget it and I haven't managed. I paid for real catering this year. I'm not having her show up in one of those cardigans and wreck the whole aesthetic. I have never been so glad about a headache in my life. A headache. Because I'd texted the day before to confirm the time, and Bryn had written back asking whether I was still feeling all right, and I'd said fine, why? She'd told them I had a headache. She'd told a room full of people I wasn't coming, 4 hours before I was due, so that when I did arrive it would already be strange that I was there. And I stood on that mat. I want to describe what happened in my body, because it wasn't what I would have predicted. I didn't cry. My eyes didn't even go. I got cold, physically cold, from the sternum out, and completely still. And my hearing did something where everything got very clear. I could hear a glass being set down inside, and a car 3 streets over. And a single sentence arrived in my head, fully formed, and it was this. There's nothing left in the allowance. That's it. 41 years of a trade, and that's what my brain handed me on a porch. I set the pie down on the rail, level, on the wide part, so it wouldn't slide. And I walked back down those steps and along the sidewalk to my car, and I did not look back at that house one time. And I sat down in the driver's seat, and I did not start the engine. I took out my phone. Because that catering she was so pleased about that was Copper Kettle, and she'd sent me the quote in October, and I had said, don't be silly, put it on mine, and I had given that woman my card number over the telephone myself. $685, plus the gratuity. Delivery window was 3 to 3:30. It was 20 past 2. And I opened the banking app and I locked that card and I killed the pending authorization. 2 taps. Took about 11 seconds. And then I sat there for a minute. Because I want to be honest with you about this. I knew what I was doing. I want that clear. I was not confused and I was not in a fog, and I did not do it in a rage. I did it deliberately. Sitting in a Buick, And I knew that in about 40 minutes there were going to be 20 people in that house and no food. And I did it anyway. And I have never once been sorry. And I'll tell you at the end why I think that's all right and also why I think it isn't completely. I drove home. 22 minutes. I did not turn the radio on. And I hung up my coat and I made a turkey sandwich from a package of deli meat on the good bread with the horseradish mustard Ansel liked, and I sat at my own table and ate it. And it was a very good sandwich. I remember that clearly, and I've thought about how strange it is that I remember it. At 6 minutes to 4, my phone went off against the counter hard enough to move. Niels. I chewed what I had and swallowed it, and then I picked it up. And his voice was up about an octave. He said, Mom, did you do something to the card? And I said I did. And he said, the copper kettle truck is in the driveway and they won't unload. The guy says it declined. Mom, there are 20 people here. Bryn's parents are in the living room. Can you unlock it? I'll pay you back Monday, I swear. And I set the plate down and I looked out my kitchen window at Hattie Bosma's fence. And I said, Nils, I was on the porch at 2:15. I brought a cherry pie. And there was nothing on that line. I have never in my life heard a silence like the one that came out of my son's phone. I could hear the room behind him. I could hear Bryn's voice, somewhere further off, going hard at somebody about a delivery. I could hear a child, and I could hear my son not breathing. And then he said, You were... And he couldn't finish it. And I said, I heard what she said, and I heard you laugh, and I want you to know that's the part I'll be working on. And he said, Mom, it was a joke. She's been stressed about today for 2 weeks. She didn't mean... And I said, since the old bat isn't coming, the old bat isn't paying for the meal. Those two things go together. Work out your dinner, sweetheart. And I hung up. And I put that phone face down on the counter and I finished my sandwich. And here's what I noticed and did not expect. My hands were steady. My heart was going at a completely normal rate. I had spent 3 years bracing for the day. I'd have to say something to those two, and I'd always imagined it as a scene raised voices, crying, the whole thing. And it turned out to be 4 sentences and a sandwich. If you have ever put off a hard conversation for years because you were afraid of how big it would be, I want to tell you that the actual thing is almost always smaller than the dread. Almost always. The dread is the expensive part. The phone went, 30 times that night. I stopped counting around 9. I read the texts. All of them. Mom, this is insane. We had to order 6 pizzas. On Thanksgiving. Bryn is crying in the bedroom. Her mother is asking questions. You humiliated us in front of her whole family. Mom, please, just call me. And I want you to notice what's not in that list. Not one of them asked how I was. Not one of them said, I'm sorry you heard that. Not one said what she said was wrong. Every single message was about the damage to their evening. That was the moment it stopped being an argument in my head. That was when I understood I hadn't overreacted, because a person who'd wronged you and knew it would have led with something else entirely. I didn't answer any of them. What I did instead was open my laptop at the kitchen table, and I did 4 things over about 2 hours. I changed the passwords on the streaming accounts and signed out every device. I called the cable company's automated line and scheduled the internet at the big house to shut off the following Monday. I logged into the credit union and set up a removal request on the co-signature for the car, which, I found out, isn't as simple as a click, and took 6 weeks and a refinance on his end, but the request went in that night. And then I wrote an email to Roz Bellinger, who did the closing on my townhouse in 2020, and asked her to pull comps on the big house and meet me Monday morning. And then I made a cup of tea and sat in a silent house. And it was quiet in a way it had not been quiet in 3 years. Not lonely. I want to be exact about that, because those two things get confused constantly by people who haven't lived alone. Lonely is when the silence is missing somebody. That silence was just mine. They came Friday morning at 9:10. I looked through the glass, and there they were on my little porch. Nils looked like he hadn't slept, and Bryn had her arms folded so tight her shoulders were up by her ears. I opened the door about 18 inches, and I did not step back. And Nils said, Mom, can we come in? We need to talk about last night. And I said, we can do it right here. And that was the first time in 34 years I had not let my son into a room I was in, and he felt it, and I watched him feel it. And Bryn came forward. She said, You humiliated me, Willa. My parents ate delivery pizza off my grandmother's china. Do you have any idea what that was like for me? And I said, I know exactly what it was like. That's why I did it. And she said, over a comment. You blew up an entire holiday over one stupid comment. And I said, you called me an old bat and told a room full of people you were glad I wasn't there. I gave you precisely what you said you wanted, which is a Thanksgiving with no trace of me in it. The food had my name on it. And she said, that's not fair. I was stressed. And then she said the thing that people like her always say, which is, you're overreacting. You always do this. You always make everything about you. Now, I'd like to tell you I had a perfect answer. What I actually did was not answer her at all. I turned to my son and I put my hand out, palm up, and I said, Nils, my spare key. And he blinked. He said, what? Mom, why? And I said, because you don't have free access to my home anymore. And he said, come on, this is crazy. And I said, the key. Now. And I dropped my voice, which is a thing I learned in a fitting room from 40 years of women who wanted a dress to do something a dress cannot do. You don't get louder. You get lower. And you stop moving. And he looked at his wife, and she looked at the porch floor, and he reached into his pocket and worked my key off his ring and put it in my hand. And I closed my fingers around it. And then I said the thing I'd decided at 2 a.m. I said, I'm putting the house on the market. You've got until the end of December to find somewhere. And Bryn's voice came apart. She said, you can't. That's our home. We've redone the whole downstairs. We're setting up the back bedroom as a nursery. And I said it gently, which somehow made it land harder. It's my house. My name is the only name on the deed. I've paid the taxes on it for 3 years, and the insurance and the furnace and the roof, and you have lived in it free since 2021. That arrangement is finished. And Nils said, Mom, be reasonable. We looked at rents last night. We can't carry a mortgage on anything like that place. And I said, no, you can't. That's true, and I'm not being unkind when I say it. You've been living in a house neither of you could afford, and you've been able to do that because I've been standing under it. And Bryn said, you're doing this because I didn't want your pie. And I said, no. And I said, I'm doing it because for 3 years I have been letting out a seam and there is nothing left in it, and I should have told you that a long time before yesterday. She didn't know what I meant. I could see that she didn't. And I said goodbye and I shut my door and I turned the deadbolt, and through it I could hear her going at him on my walk. And I went into my kitchen and put the radio on. Roz put the sign in that lawn Monday at 11. I wasn't there. I made a point of not being there. My phone rang 9 minutes later and I let it go. Now the furniture, which is the part everybody asks about. There were 4 pieces in that house that were Ansel's mother's. A mahogany dining table with 2 leaves, 6 chairs, a credenza, and a tall clock in the front hall that has been in that family since 1911 and that Ansel wound every Sunday night of our marriage. Bryn had been calling those pieces the vintage for 3 years. She'd had them in a photograph in a trade magazine. And I knew I did not suspect. I knew that if I left them in that house for 30 days, either they'd end up in a storage unit under her name, or something would happen to them. So on the Tuesday, I hired 3 men and a truck for 2 hours. And I went at 1:30 in the afternoon because Nils was at work and Bryn had a standing Tuesday thing at noon. And I let myself in with my key to my house. And I want to tell you what that house looked like inside, because it did something to me. There were pizza boxes from Thursday still on my counter. 4 days. There was a laundry basket on the dining table, with clothes hanging over the edge onto the wood. And that woman had told a room full of people that I would wreck her aesthetic. I stood in my own front hall, and I laughed out loud. 1 syllable. Completely involuntary. The men were good. Quick, careful, blankets on everything. They had the credenza and the chairs out and were bringing the table through the front door when tires came into that driveway hard. White SUV, at an angle blocking the truck completely. And Bryn came out of it in workout clothes with her face the color of a brick. And she came up those steps shouting, "Put that down. Those are mine. Those are in my dining room." And she tried to get past the man at the front of the table. And I stepped into that doorway. Now I want to slow this all the way down, because it took about 4 minutes, and it's the part I'd want on film if I could have any of it on film. I did not shout, not one time, and I want that understood. I said, "They're Ansel's mother's, and they're coming with me." And she said, "Nils promised me those." And I said, "Nils can't promise you a thing he doesn't own. He's never owned one board of that table." And she said, "You broke into my house, and you're stealing my furniture." And I said, "I let myself into my house with my key, and I'm removing my property." And she was standing in front of me on that porch in the cold with her hands in fists, and I looked past her at that SUV sitting across the driveway. And I said, "Move your car, please. The truck needs to get out." And she planted her feet. She said, "No. Nothing moves until that table goes back inside." And here's what I understood in that second, and it's the only tactical thing in this whole story. She was making a scene on purpose. She had chosen a driveway, in daylight, on a street where people know each other. She was counting on me being a 64-year-old woman who would rather fold than be seen arguing in front of the neighbors, which had been an excellent read on me for 3 years. I took my phone out of my coat pocket, and I said, "You have 2 options. You move that car, or I call a tow and have it taken off my property. I'm going to count to 5. And her mouth came open, and she looked around. And here's the thing she found when she looked. Hattie Bosma was standing in her own front window with the blind pulled up, not even pretending, and the Petrosky boy was out at the curb with his dog, and he'd stopped walking. And a car had slowed on the street. She had wanted an audience. She got one, and it was not on her side, and she could see that in about a second and a half, because nobody had come across a lawn, and nobody was going to. And I got to 3. And she said, and her voice was shaking with it, "You are a bitter, selfish old woman." And I said 4. And she turned around and went to that SUV, and backed it into the street so hard she took the corner off my curb. And I said thank you to the men, and they finished loading, and I locked my own front door and drove away. And that night, this is the bit I did not put in the story for 2 years, I sat in my little living room with a grandfather clock I had nowhere to put, jammed into a corner at an angle, and I cried for about 40 minutes. Not about her, about Ansel, and about that clock, and about the fact that it was in a rented-looking corner of a townhouse instead of a hall it had stood in since 1988. You can be completely right, and still be the one sitting up at 11 o'clock crying about a clock. Nils came Wednesday night, alone. I led him into the hallway, not the living room, the hallway. He looked 10 years older than he had a week earlier. He'd been sleeping badly, and it showed in his whole face. He said, "She's not okay, Mom. She's been screaming about the furniture for 2 days, and I don't know what to do." And I said, "You pack." And he said, "Mom." And then he said the thing he'd come to say. He said, Can you pause the sale just till spring? We looked at places. With the car payments and her cards, we can't get anything decent. We don't even have first and last." And I said, "No." And he said, "You've got the money." And I said, "I do, and I'm keeping it." And then I said the sentence I'd been building for a week, and I'd rewritten it about 9 times, and I got it out in one piece. I said, "Nils, you sat in a room and let your wife call your mother an old bat, and you laughed. And when I called you on it in 3 days of texting, not one time did you ask me how I was. You asked me to fix the evening." I said, "I'm not closing the bank because of what she said. I'm closing it because of what you didn't." And my son stood in my hallway and put his hand over his mouth. And he said, "I know." Just that. He didn't argue. He didn't build a case. And that's the only reason there's a good ending to any of this, and I didn't know it at the time. Now I promised I'd be fair about Bryn, so here it is, and I only learned it in March. Her mother told me. Cheryl. At the closing, of all places, in a lobby, and I think she'd been waiting a year for somebody to say it to. Bryn grew up in a house nobody could come into. Her mother, Cheryl's own sister, actually. Bryn's mother is not Cheryl. I got the family wrong for 4 years, could not manage a house. Clutter to the ceiling in 2 rooms. Bryn did not have a friend inside that house one time between the ages of 9 and 18. Not once. She used to meet people at the end of the driveway. And Cheryl said, "When she says aesthetic, Willa, I know how it sounds. It isn't about magazines. That girl built a house you could walk into, and it is the only thing she has ever been proud of." And I sat in the lobby and had to look at the carpet for a second, because I understood something I had not understood in 4 years. To me, a cardigan from the resale shop on Wealthy Street is thrift. It's sensible. It's how I was raised, and it's how I bought a building in 1983. To her, it was the past walking back through the front door. And me refolding her napkins wasn't an old woman being particular. It was somebody standing in the one room she'd built as proof that she got out, saying with her hands, not her mouth, "You haven't done this right." That is not an excuse for what she said through that window. It was cruel and it was calculated, and telling that room I had a headache 4 hours in advance was a lie she constructed on purpose. But it is a reason, and understanding it cost me nothing, and it is the only thing that made the next 2 years survivable. The 30 days went. On the last day I drove out for the walkthrough, and there was a small U-Haul in that driveway. Nils was trying to get a mattress in the back of it by himself and losing. Bryn came out the front with a box, and she stopped when she saw me. She had her hair up in a knot and no makeup, and I think she'd been wearing that sweatshirt for a while, and she looked about 19 years old and completely wrung out. And she looked at me, and neither of us said a word, and she put the box in the truck and went back inside. I went through that house room by room. Empty. The way rooms echo when they're empty, which I had forgotten. I stood in the front hall where the clock had been, and there was a rectangle on the wall paint about 4 shades darker than the rest. 35 years of that clock standing in one spot. And that's when the thing I'd been circling for a month finally landed on me properly. You can let down a hem, you can press it flat, you can steam it, you can do everything right. The crease still shows. Some accommodations leave a permanent mark on the fabric, and you do not get to unmake them. That's true of a garment, and it turns out it's true of a family. Nils came in as I was finishing and handed me the keys, all of them, on the ring. He said, "We're out." And I said, "Drive safe." And he stood there a second longer, and I could see him trying to get to something, and he couldn't get to it, and he nodded and went. The house sold in 19 days over asking, to a couple with 2 little girls and a dog the size of a coffee table. And I did not do anything extravagant with the money. I put most of it where it belongs. I gave a chunk to a legal aid fund here that helps older women who've been signed onto things they shouldn't have been signed onto, which I chose on purpose. And I spent about $11,000 on my little backyard. Brick patio, raised beds, a fence, and a proper wall for the clock, which needed a stud fix and a leveling job. And I joined a walking group that goes at 7 in the morning out of the church lot, 4 women, and one of them is named Lucienne, and she has become the closest friend I have had since 1994. Neil texted me in June. "Hi, Mom. Apartment's small, but it's fine. Bryn and I started counseling. Hope you're doing all right." And I read that about 4 times. Because look at what's in it. There's no ask. There's no fix this. There's no we've been talking and we think. It's a man giving his mother a piece of information at a distance and not requiring anything for it. And I wrote back, "I'm doing very well. I'm glad you're going. Give it a year before you decide if it's working." And I put the phone down, and I did not sit there waiting. We're all right now, 2 years on. It took about 14 months to be anything at all, and it is not what it was, and I've stopped wanting it to be. He comes the first Sunday of the month. Bryn came at Christmas last year and brought a pie, which I know exactly what it was, and I ate 2 pieces and said it was good, and it was. We have never once discussed that porch. Any of us. There's a crease. There always will be. Here's what all of this taught me, and it isn't set boundaries, which is a phrase I'd like to see retired. Here's the real one. Every garment has a seam allowance, a specific, finite amount of hidden fabric that lets you make it bigger when somebody grows. And when a customer stood on my box and said, "Just let it out a little more," my job, the actual job I was paid for, was to tell them the truth about how much was left. I said that sentence to strangers for 41 years. I never said it once to my son, not one time in 3 years. I let it out for the taxes. I let it out for the internet. I let it out for the car loan and the furnace and the roof, and every single time I let it out, it fit again, and nobody had to have a conversation, and I told myself that was love. It wasn't love, it was avoidance with good stitching on it. And here's the part that's mine, and I said I'd say it. They were not wrong about the thermostat. They were not wrong about the napkins. I was letting myself into a house on a Tuesday afternoon and adjusting things. I was doing it because I had never actually accepted that I'd handed that house over, and if I'd been honest about that in 2021, we could have had a hard month instead of 3 bad years. They were cruel about it. I was wrong first. Both of those things are true, and I've had to make room for both. So, here's the specific thing I'd ask you to do, and it takes one evening and a piece of paper. Sit down and write out every single thing you're currently paying for that another adult uses, all of it. The streaming, the phone line, the insurance, the taxes, the co-signature you forgot about. Then put the annual number at the bottom. Don't send it to anybody. That's not what it's for. It's for you, because I promise the number in your head is smaller than the number on the paper. Mine was off by about $9,000 a year. And then do the harder half, which is one sentence out loud to the person concerned. This one ends on the 1st of March, so plan around it. Not a discussion, not a negotiation, a date. Because a seam that's been let out slowly for 3 years can't be taken back in slowly, you have to pick the whole thing and start over, and that hurts a great deal more than saying it the first year would have. And here's the question I'd want you to sit with tonight. What are you still paying for that you've never once been thanked for, and whose comfort is that silence actually protecting? Because it wasn't theirs. That's what I finally worked out on a porch with a pie in my hands. It was mine. I never said anything because saying it would have made me the difficult one, and I would rather have been the useful one for 3 years than the difficult one for an afternoon. That's the whole thing. That's the entire 3 years in one sentence. Now I want to hear from you, and I want the honest answer, not the kind one. If you think I did right canceling that catering with 40 minutes notice, comment 1. If you think 20 people who never said a word about me shouldn't have had their holiday blown up over something 2 of them said, and Nils has made that argument to me, and it's not a bad one, comment 2. And if you think the failure in this whole story was mine years earlier, when I moved out of that house and never once stopped acting like it was still mine, comment 3. That's the one I'd pick. That's the one I still turn over on the mornings I can't sleep. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every one of them. There is something about an old seamstress in Michigan knowing somebody's hearing this at 6 in the morning, half a world away, that I can't quite put into words. And if you've ever stood outside a room and heard what people say about you when they think you're not coming, say so down below. You don't have to give one detail. Somebody scrolling past tonight is standing on a porch right now with something warm in their hands, and it would help them to know how this can go. If you want more of these, subscribe and stay with me a while. It's ordinary people, one bad afternoon, and what they turned out to be made of when it came. I'd be glad to have you here. 41 years I told people the same thing in a fitting room, and I never once told my own child. There's only so much fabric folded under there, and when it's gone, and no amount of wanting puts it back. This is a fictional story, inspired by real emotional experiences. Fully rewritten and reimagined in Grand Rapids, Michigan, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.